Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today we're making a Chinese checkers board. Why? Because I don't like playing on cardboard. I would rather play on white oak. Let's dive in. When making a Chinese checkers board, it is vitally important to make it out of Chinese oak. But this is wood by Wright and I'm contractually obligated to make it out of white oak. So here we go. I have a nice piece of white oak. This is about 13 inches across, and I figured it'd be a good one to pull this out of the middle of. Now, making a Chinese checkers board is all about geometry, and probably the most difficult and hardest part of this is just figuring out the geometry and the lines layout on here. To make it simple, you're basically making two isosceles triangles that overlap by 2/3. Now, there are a bunch of videos online about how to draw a David star or six-pointed star, and they work out really well. I, for one, actually like to just experiment and play with it. And so I had an absolute blast figuring this thing out. And Luke and I were going back and forth on numbers and measurements and doing the geometry and actually using some of the geometry knowledge gained over the years of if this, then that. And there's a lot of logic involved in that. And I really enjoyed this step. It's one of those things that it's just kind of cool. And thankfully, I actually got to do this step twice because I made a vital mistake on the beginning. And that is that the exterior dimensions of this measurement on this board need to be the measurements of the board itself for the final game. I made the assumption that the marbles are going to be the perimeter, and so I started laying out where the marble holes need to go, and that ended up putting the marble holes in the wrong places, and that caused all sorts of other issues, so I ended up drawing it twice, but I really enjoyed this. The nice thing about doing this is that all of these lines that are measuring should be all about the exact same. Once I have that, then I can start laying out where the rows for all of these need to go, and basically, we're making a grid separated by 120 degrees. And this grid is going to cover the whole board. And so you have all of these parallel lines in one direction. And then you rotate 120 degrees and you have all the parallel lines in the other direction. And then you rotate another 120 degrees and you have all the parallel lines in the other direction. And where all those lines intersect, you put a divot where the marble goes. And so you're just trying to figure out what is the measurement between all of these lines, and then you draw them across the board. And I'm actually just going to be using a marking knife to put in a nice deep mark in there. I'm going to be chiseling it out eventually, but it was around this point I realized what I was doing, and I put my first row of marble holes smack on the outside of the board. And so that meant if any marble is sitting on there, it's just going to fall off. Then I was thinking, okay, do I actually build a perimeter to go around the board and expand it out? And this ended up being a whole mind boggle. But in the end, I figured, let's just flip this thing over and draw it from the other side. So that meant I got to come over and do it all over again. And I really enjoyed it one more time, using straight edges and a bevel edge and protractors and calipers and measurement. I just really enjoyed this. So again, you're making two big isosceles triangles, which means all three legs of the triangle should be the same length. And they're going to overlap 2/3. And once you get that down and you figure out how to measure the 2/3, it actually goes together pretty quickly. I'm going to draw the outside diameter of the board, and then I'm going to repeat this whole process with moving the lines in a little bit. I want my marbles to be inset about a 1/2 inch into the board. So once I draw the outside lines of the whole star, I'm then just going to move the straight edge in a 1/2 inch and continue that line all the way around 1/2 inch in. And this line that I'm drawing is the first row of marble lines. And so once I get that drawn all the way around 1/2 inch in on each of these lines, now I can set up the difference between them. And this is where I have a lot of the math issues, is that I need 8 spaces in between each line. And so I measure it out and it's some random number, and then I have to figure out, okay, how do I divide that by 8 and then change it into fractions because I'm working in America and, oh, dumb freedom units. One of these days we'll just switch over to metric and it'll be so much easier. It'll all be decimal. But yeah, I'm going to put these 2 pins in, and you push it in once I get the exact measurement from the calipers, and then I can put the dividers into those pinholes I just created with the calipers, and now my dividers should be precisely the right width apart for all the lines. And I can set it on the first line and walk it across the board, and theoretically this will create a dimple all the way across the board exactly where the lines need to be. So then I can go to the other end and put dimples on that end, and now it's just a game of connect the dots across the board. And we're creating all of these parallel lines, whatever that measurement is apart, and wherever the lines intersect, that is where the dimple needs to go for the marble. And once it all comes together, it's actually really beautiful how all of the lines intersect almost dead on. And yeah, it is a very, very rewarding step because there is this immediate thing of, oh, look, those lines just intersect and it's perfect. And when you get out onto this tip, you're not actually going by any of the marks you had, just you make the lines intersect. And then this last one is just this 10 point. It goes point to point and it's done. That's all it is. It's very pleasing. So now that we have this all laid out, now I'm actually going to go back through and I want to color the outside triangles. And originally I was thinking I'm going to dye the wood there, and dyeing oak with specific shapes is incredibly difficult. I really couldn't find a good way to do it without it bleeding into the grain around. Even if you pre-stain some areas and not others, it's just going to be an absolute pain. So in this case, I just decided to inset it and fill them with different colored epoxies. I know a bunch of people just unsubscribed from the channel, but yes, epoxy has actually been around in woodworking for almost 100 years now, and it's not a fad. It's something that has been going on for a long time, and it's going to continue because it's a great resource for this particular application. And I think when you look at this at the end, you'll see, yeah, that was the right choice. And it doesn't need to be very deep. I only need to go down about 1/8 inch. So I'm going to lay out a line around a 1/4 inch in from the perimeter of the board. And this will create a triangular cut in. And I can take the chisel, run around the outside, and define the perimeter. And then come in with another chisel, bevel down, and work back to that perimeter. And most of this can come out with the router plane. It is the fastest and easiest way to do it. You don't have to make this a perfectly flat and level bottom because you're going to be filling it with epoxy. You're not going to be actually inlaying anything. So you can just do it with a chisel, bevel down. But if you've got a router plane, it's the way to go. It's just an incredible amount of fun to take it down to depth. Now you're not going to be able to get dead into the corners, even with the fine tooth one that comes to a point. It isn't fine enough to get back in there for the one I had. So I had to do a little bit of work with the chisel to get right tight into the corner. But I found using my marking knife, I could actually get back in and remove the waste between the cuts. And once you cut it down to 1/8 inch, then you're pretty much ready to fill it in. Now, I filled in one as a test, and then I ended up doing all of them at the same time. And I wish I had done 3 every other at one time, and then 3 every other at the other time, and that way the corners wouldn't bleed into each other quite as easily. I'm actually going to be using Total Boat High Performance because it's the glue I have on hand. I'm not looking for anything structural, which this is kind of a structural glue. I'm just looking for something that will apply. And for something thin like this works fine. If I'm going for something thicker, then this will not. And I'm going to be using a bunch of different tints that I have. I'm just looking for something with the most solid color. A couple of these, actually 4 of these ended up being a solid color, and 2 of them I actually didn't have a dye to make it opaque. So 2 of them are actually kind of clearish, and it actually worked out pretty well. I'm going to fill these until the surface tension on it has it bubble up just a little bit, and then we can use a level to make sure that this is level and let it sit. And of course, the fun part of popping the bubbles with a propane torch or a butane torch, it's just fun. And so this has an ever so slight amount, so it's bubbling up over. The surface tension is a little high on it. And with that, now you got all of them. You can see how some of these corners have bled through a little bit. That makes me wish that I had done 3 at a time rather than all 5 other ones, because they just kind of ran over a little bit right where the corners touched. If I had done them 3 at a time, then they wouldn't be able to bleed into each other. So we're going to rough cut this to shape, and then we can start cleaning it up. For epoxy, the card scraper really is the way to go. It is so much faster than sanding. This whole board took me, 5-6 minutes to completely clean down, and it gives you a beautiful surface all the way across. Card scraper is just really, really good. I mean, I could use the cabinet scraper on this, but most of the time, if it's going to take me 5 minutes or less, I'm just going to use the card scraper. The cabinet scraper just takes a little bit more time to set up. If I'm doing a large surface like a dining room table, then it is the cabinet scraper all the way. And plus, you can't beat these curls. Epoxy curls are just fun. They're actually more like a epoxy wafer. Yeah, really kind of cool. So scrape it all down, scrape it nice and flat, and then we can go about putting the lines back into the epoxy. That's the one downside of putting all the lines in ahead of time is that you're just going to cut out the ones. So I wish I hadn't done that, but yeah, that's the way it goes. I'm going to hit it all with 400 grit sandpaper, and that just lets me know a couple places that I missed, and then I can come back through and scrape it off. For the final finishing, I will be hitting it with a very fine sandpaper just to touch it up. For right now, it allows you to see any spots that you missed. Sandpaper is really good at pointing things out. So we can come back through and add in those lines, and a couple of them I just want to make a little bit deeper because we're going to be carving these out a little bit later. And surprisingly, yes, you can line epoxy. It works out really, really well. I'm going to be using a fine V tool to come in here and carve them out. For some of them, I found using the mallet works well, and for some, I like using this stabbing motion. It comes across pretty well. The epoxy actually carves really beautifully, and it holds into that knife line, and you get a nice straight line. The wood was actually more difficult to carve because it wanted to go away with the groove, with the grain. Once you got into the epoxy, it just slid right along that very nicely. So this took, 5-6 minutes to do all the lines. And nice straight lines are easy to do. And this, I wasn't sure if I would do this and just leave the knife lines in there. I'm really glad I put this in. It just adds a little bit extra depth and finishes off the board, makes it rather beautiful. And of course, you get these beautiful curls coming off. Freehand carving is incredibly joyful, and it's fun. If you think, wow, I wouldn't be able to do this freehand, give it a try. It is surprisingly good. Yeah, your lines won't be perfectly straight. Oh well, that's really not a problem. No one's ever going to notice other than you, so don't worry about it. Have a little bit of fun and enjoy the process. And it's one of those skills that you're really happy you have because it's just really kind of cool. I'm going to come in with a set and dimple the middle of all of these intersections. It'll just make it a little bit easier for the bit to hold in. For drilling the actual dimples for the holes, I tried a bunch of different methods. My initial thought is I'm just going to use a larger twist bit and create a little dimple there. And that worked out pretty well, but it was hard to find a twist bit that left me a clean surface. I used a ball burr on some of them, and that worked out okay. I used a chamfer bit, and that worked out pretty well. So I used a couple different twist bit sizes, and I tried them going deeper and shallower, and I tried different ones that I wanted. And in the end, I actually found I liked to use the chamfer bit, the countersink bit. It worked out really, really well, and it holds them nicely. And so I experimented with setting them back and forth, which one feels better, which one looks better. And the countersink bit gave me the cleanest hole and the nicest surface. So then I experimented with doing it in epoxy, using depth stops, and playing with a bunch of other things. And in the end, I chose the countersink bit. I actually liked the surface it gave me a little bit better, except for in the epoxy. In the epoxy, the countersink bit just didn't work. But in the epoxy, I didn't have to worry about tear out. So I just used this depth stop, and it allowed me to go in on the epoxy with the regular twist bit. I think it was a 3/8 twist bit, something around that line. And yes, I am using a devil-possessed drill, but that works out really well because you're going to have to drill a lot of these holes. It was, 121 holes that have to be drilled. So it's nice to be able to just grab a drill and go to town on it. For the middle ones, I ended up actually using a brace and bit for the wood because my countersink bit has a square tapered bit, and so for that I ended up actually just using the brace and bit. And it goes surprisingly quickly, but for the epoxy, yeah, the power drill worked out well. And I was really happy with how clean the surface on this gets, and especially with that pointed hole, it gave you a really nice location into that dimple. And after that, here is the last one. This step took a surprising amount of time. But after that, we are basically done with the board. You can play it, and you have the choice of leaving it square or shaping it up. And I actually decided I'm going to shape this one up. And so because a lot of these cuts were a little bit deeper than my back saw could go, out comes the Japanese saw. I don't use it that often as I find it a good bit slower, and it is very, very hard to steer. If you don't set it up perfectly right off the bat, it's a pain to put back on track. But if you do set it up on track, it tracks right along, and it's rather beautiful. And so if I'm using an Asian board, I need to cut it with an Asian saw. Isn't that how the way it works? I know I'm mixing Asian ethnicities, I'm sorry, but I like this one. and it works out well in this application. So after cutting all these down, you're going to be left with some raw saw marks, and unless you have a beautifully set up saw and perfect cut, yeah, you're going to have to want to come back and clean these up. The problem is every one of these faces is going with a different grain direction, and most of them are turning away from the middle, so you actually need to plane out from the middle to clean them up. And so to do that, I'm using a lot of a chisel, but then I also got a really nice rabbiting edge block plane from Lee Nielsen, and this really came into it well. So I could get close to the edge, and then I can kind of smear out at the end and go at it. I'm chamfering the edges so that the edge of the chamfer just touches into the epoxy. And it's really nice when you can go with the grain back into the corner. This allows you to cut right back in. And freehand chisel work, it's a lot of fun. Again, making the corner just touch the epoxy. And I like the way that looks. It just kind of makes this whole board finished and clean. And I'm really, really happy with how that came out. For the finishing and the cleaning up on this, I'm going to hit it all with a high grit 400 grit sandpaper. And this will, in the wood, allow the dust to fill the pores, which will allow the epoxy to get down a little farther. The finish I'm using to get down a little farther. And for the coat, I'm going to be just using boiled linseed oil and paste wax. I could do something more durable, like a Rubio monocoat, but for this, it doesn't really need terribly durable. It's something that's going to go in the toy storage. And I'm just going to use my normal. I'm going to clean out all the dust with some alcohol, and then I'm going to come in once that's all dried and apply the boiled linseed oil. And I love the way this brings out that oak. It is just absolutely gorgeous. And applying into the epoxy, it still will bond onto the epoxy and gives you a nice clean surface. It brings out the color and the clarity in the epoxy without making it a glass finish. BLO will not give you a glass finish on epoxy, but it will give you a nice clean slightly matte finish. And I really love the colors and how this thing just pops. It was a fantastic project. And this one was a lot of fun. And we can play our family game of Chinese checkers. It's a good one to play with the kids because it doesn't take very long and it can hold their mindset. And yeah, my wife beat me in the first one, of course. I was one move behind her. Oh well, I'll beat her on the next one. But yeah, simple, fun project. And I really like how this came out. Looking forward to using it for years to come. And this is just a really fun time. Very, very happy. So there you have it, Chinese checkers board. This was a lot of fun. Took me somewhere around 4 hours or so total. Yeah, the layout on it is interesting, and I still kept the lines on the back. It's one of those fun things to play around with geometry, and I really like this one. This is a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to playing it more with the kids in the future. So I've got marbles. Now I might need to make a box to put them in, so stay tuned for that one. I think that'll do it for now. If you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, snide remarks, or just want to say comment down below, throw those down below. I do read through all the comments and I answer as many of them as I can get to. And if you do put a comment down below, you are helping out the channel. So thank you for that. It's just like hitting like, share, subscribe. Thank you. Honestly, that gets us in front of more people, helps the channel grow, and means a lot. And there are people who go even farther than that. Those are all of the patrons on Patreon over here. They are the wonderful and magnificent, beautiful, gorgeous people over on Patreon. Thank you. We are completely sponsored by you, the viewer. So if you'd like to help out with that, you can click on the description down below or click the little join button and become a member here on YouTube. We have special perks for both patrons and members. So I think that'll do it for now. Until next time, have a wonderful day. You'll have to pardon me when I'm talking about this. I'm using a rather colorful language.